has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
So it's been about a year and a half or so since we began the Gospel of Mark. And one of the things that we've seen as we've gone through this book is that really everything in it, in Jesus' life and ministry, has been pointing towards the cross. In other words, the cross wasn't an accident. The cross didn't take Jesus by surprise. It wasn't an epic fail. Jesus, as some authors and scholars now say, he didn't die a failed revolutionary. No, Jesus' death was the revolution. And you see, that's why over and over and over again we've seen through Mark's gospel that Jesus would get his disciples and followers together and he'd say, listen, here's the plan. I'm going to die and I'm going to rise again. I'm going to die and rise again. Let me share with you a few examples. One here in Mark chapter 8, verse 31. It says, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he spoke plainly about this. And then it says, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, Peter, we've kind of seen, had a foot-shaped mouth, right? And here he is rebuking the Son of God. Never a good idea to get in an argument with God. Like, chances are you'll lose that argument. And if you keep reading, he lost that one too. But Jesus, he's wanting his disciples to know, listen, this is why I came. This is my purpose. My death is central to my mission. So we have in Mark chapter 9, Jesus says, I'm going to die and rise again. Mark chapter 10, I'm going to the cross and then I will rise again. Mark chapter 14, I will die and rise again. From Jesus' birth, all the way through his ministry to his death, the cross cast its shadow ahead of him. And you see, that's why what we're doing this afternoon is so important and pivotal to our faith, because we're coming back to the cross. We're taking time as a church, as individuals, as families, to reflect, to think, to consider, to pray, to allow what Jesus did for us to begin to impact and change and transform our hearts. So let's pick it up in verse 15. We actually left off in verse 15 last week, but I want to revisit it. It says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. And he had Jesus flogged, and he handed him over to be crucified. Now, if you were here with us last week, we had the whole story of Pilate and Barabbas. And we saw there how Jesus took the place of Barabbas and how we in our own life can be like Barabbas. But notice what Pilate does next. It says that he delivered Jesus to be crucified, but before that, it says that he had Jesus flogged. The Roman practice of flogging was one of the most barbaric punishments imaginable. In fact, early Roman authors who were around in this first century, they had a nickname for flogging. They called it the half-death. Here's a picture of what we think the flagellum or the flog would have looked like. Basically, it's a short whip, a stick. And then coming out of that stick are these long leather thongs. Tied into these thongs are sharp pieces of metal and bone, along with these small iron balls. And it was crafted in such a way and designed to cause the maximum amount of pain. What they would do is they would take the victim, they would strip that victim of their clothing, they would then tie their hands to a small wooden post. And these soldiers called lictors, one by one, taking turns, they would begin to beat that prisoner over and over again. And the purpose of that beating was, in their mind, to take that prisoner right to the edge of death. And so what would happen as they began to beat the victim is that the small iron balls would begin to bruise the skin. And then as the whips continued, the small pieces of metal and bone would begin to dig into the victim's flesh, literally ripping apart the skin, ripping into the muscles, and in many cases exposing the bone. And it would leave the victim in a state of shock and in many cases close to death or completely dead. In fact, there's lots of instances historically where they just wouldn't survive this. Isaiah, he tells us what it would have been like for Jesus. In Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, he says, "There were many who were appalled at him, and his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness." In other words, what Isaiah is saying hundreds of years before Jesus came is that after they were done flogging, beating, whipping Jesus, that you wouldn't have been able to recognize him. The text continues in verse 16. It says, "The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium. And they called together the whole company of soldiers, and they put a purple robe on him. And they twisted together a crown of thorns, and they set it on him. And they began to call out to him, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And again they struck him on the head with a staff, and they spit on him, and falling on their knees, they paid homage to him." Now you would think that after all that Jesus had gone through, being beaten and whipped and flogged, his back literally being torn apart by this flagellum, you would think that these Roman soldiers would have a sense of decency and humanity. Come on, give the guy a break. Right? He doesn't deserve any more. Leave him alone. But Mark tells us that, in fact, they were just getting started. Our text tells us that they put a purple robe on him. Purple in the ancient world was a symbol of royalty. They put a crown of thorns on his head. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, you may remember, after the fall, we read that thorns and thistles would spring up. Thorns were seen as a byproduct of the fall of man. And what we have here then, by wearing this crown of thorns, Jesus is symbolically taking the curse, the sin of humanity. They began to beat that crown of thorns into his skull with a staff. They spat on him. They mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." This was actually a parody of Caesar's salute. Every year, these Roman soldiers would be required to say, "Ave Caesar, Victor, Imperator," and yet here they're turning that around as a means of sarcasm. They're saying, "Look, Jesus, People say that you're a king, but we know that you're not. Jesus, you're no power or match for Rome. Your kingdom, Jesus, it's a lie. It's a parody. You're weak. You're nothing compared to Caesar. You're nothing compared to the power that we have. And the reason that they would do this to Jesus and say this to Jesus is that they're living in a culture and part of a system that told them that true power is power over others. Domination, control, strength over others. But Jesus, this man who's standing before them, who's been beaten to a pulp, whipped and mocked and spat upon, this man is showing a different way. For the way of the cross is not power over, but it's power under. And what Jesus modeled in his life was the release of control, the choosing of weakness over strength, pursuing servanthood over domination. Jesus' kingdom was an upside down kingdom where all the values of this world that we admire, strength, influence, control, were subverted and undone and eventually overcome through the power of weakness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he said this: the cross cannot be defeated, for it is defeat. Paul, in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 1, he said, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. I love that word power that Paul uses there. In the Greek, it's the word dunamos. It's where we get the word for dynamite. In other words, Paul is saying that the cross, it's explosive, it's life-changing, it's landscape-altering, it's worldview changing. There's something about this cross, there's something about this Jesus that when you're exposed to it, it will do one of two things. Either you're going to reject him and fight him and rage against him, or you're going to bow the knee and call him Lord. Neutrality with Jesus isn't an option. In the words of that great theologian, biblical scholar, and the first hipster, Bob Dylan, he said, you've got to serve somebody, right? It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you have got to serve somebody. That's what we're going to see in this chapter. That people, when confronted by the cross, they're either going to serve him and follow him and be changed by him, or they're going to, like these soldiers, beat him and mock him and turn against him. Verse 20, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and they put his own clothes on him. And then they led him out to crucify him. And a certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. It's interesting language, isn't it, that Mark uses. He says that Jesus was led. He was led from the praetorium outside of the city walls. We saw earlier, Isaiah 53, that Jesus was led as a lamb to the slaughter. Why? Why was he led? Because Jesus, he had been beaten, whipped. He's lost blood. He's staggering from the pain. Blood and sweat filling his eyes. He can't see. He's stumbling along. He needed someone to lead him out. If you want to go deeper, in Leviticus chapter 16, it gives us another reason, and compare that with Hebrews 13, and it talks about the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Once a year, they would take 2 goats. One goat they would sacrifice inside of the city, and the other goat they would symbolically place all the sin and the shame and the guilt of the nation. He was called the scapegoat. They would then take the scapegoat, lead him outside of the city walls, and drive him out into the wilderness. And it was God's way of saying, this is what I've done with your shame. This is what I've done with your sin, as far as the east is from the west. And Hebrews, the author of Hebrews says, that's what Jesus has done for us. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. He was taken outside of the city walls. Now, if you've ever been to Israel, you know this path that Jesus would have taken. It's called the Via Dolorosa. Maybe some of you have been on this path. If not, here's a picture of it. Via Dolorosa literally means the sorrowful way. And it began near the Roman Praetorium, then wound its way through the tiny streets of Jerusalem, finally outside of the city walls. And it's here on the Via Dolorosa that we're introduced to a man called Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene is modern day Libya. Bible scholars think that he had come from Libya to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Passover. And as fate would have it, he happened to be on the Via Dolorosa when all of a sudden here come these crowds who are angry and these soldiers who are yelling at the people, and Jesus bloodied carrying this crossbeam that weighed 110 pounds, and he's buckling under the weight. He cannot carry it. And one of the Roman guards points out to Simon a face in the crowd and says, you carry that cross. And by law, he had to obey what that soldier told him. He then takes this cross and carries it for Jesus. Now, it's interesting that Mark mentions that Simon had two sons, Rufus and Alexander. And at first glance, when I was reading this through this last week, I'm like, why is that even there? I mean, this is the crucifixion of Jesus, right? I mean, it just seems like an odd detail to put in here. But as I began to dig around in the text, I realized, oh, wait a minute, there actually could be something here. Many Bible scholars believe that Rufus was actually the same Rufus who you read about in Romans chapter 16, verse 13. And if you read Romans 16, it's basically a long list of names. In that chapter, Paul says, hey, say hi to Rufus in Rome. He's a leader. He's doing a bunch of great things in the church. And so what many historians believe is that what happened is here is Simon. He's from Libya. He's in Jerusalem on the Via Dolorosa, there to celebrate Passover, about to maybe sacrifice a Passover lamb. And here comes the Lamb of God to take away the sin of the world. And he carries that cross. He is so transformed by this encounter with Jesus. He's so mesmerized by this man that he then goes back to Libya, shares it with his family. His sons become followers of Jesus. Rufus then ends up going to Rome, where he is now a leader in that church. Many Bible scholars think that could be the story. Now, obviously, there's no way of knowing 110% if that is indeed the truth, but at the very least, what I see in this story is a powerful picture of what it means to be a disciple. Simon carried the cross. We saw this, a year ago? Mark chapter 8, Jesus said, if any man wants to follow after me, if he wants to be my disciple, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow after me. You see, if for us, the cross is not just a bumper sticker or a piece of jewelry or just a Christian symbol, if the cross is a way of life, then what that means, like Simon, those around us, the Alexanders, the Rufuses, they will be impacted. They will be changed. They will be transformed by your following after this crucified Messiah. So here Simon is carrying the wood up the hill of Calvary. And we read it now in verse 22. He talks about it. He says, they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Mark says that Golgotha literally means the place of the skull. It's Aramaic. And by the way, in Latin, Golgotha is Calvaria. It's where we get the word for Calvary. So when Jesus arrives on the hill of Calvary, it says that they offered him wine mixed with myrrh to drink. Now, what's this about? Well, in the ancient world, wine and myrrh was an expensive spice. They'd mix the two together. And it was basically a narcotic to help deaden the pain. There's this whole tradition that the rabbis talk about. They say that in the first century, there was a group of women who saw it as their ministry, where whenever someone was being executed, they would take wine and myrrh and they would offer it to that victim as a gesture of humanity and compassion. And so whether it's that group of women or someone else, they come to Jesus, they offer him this, but it says Jesus didn't drink it. He didn't numb himself to the pain. Instead, he is facing the cross with clarity of thought, fully conscious, fully aware, fully engaged with the gravity of the moment. Verse 24, Mark says, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. And it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. And the written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Mark only uses 4 words in verse 24, and they crucified him. But what we don't see in those 4 words is that crucifixion was the most inhumane, most brutal form of execution imaginable. For those of you who are history buffs, you'll recognize the name Cicero. And he was talking about crucifixion in one of his works, and he said, "There is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed." It was originally invented in 800 BC by the Persians, who they then passed it on to the Carthaginians. Rome picks it up from them, and they begin to refine it, and they begin to adapt it to their situation, and they use crucifixion as a way of subjugating and controlling the lower class, slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals. And we need to know that the philosophy behind crucifixion was not just to cause the most pain imaginable. The philosophy was degradation and humiliation and shame. In fact, one Roman scholar, Quintilian, he said this: "Whenever we crucify the guilty, the most crowded roads are chosen where the most people can see and be moved by this fear." In other words, hey, when we kill people, we want everyone to notice. It's not something we do behind closed doors in a secret location. No, we do it out in public view. In fact, Spartacus, 71 BC, you may remember his story, defeated the slave army. And when he was done with that battle, he took 6,000 of those prisoners of war. He got one of the busiest roads, and he crucified all 6,000 up and down a 120-mile stretch of road. So could you imagine, from here all the way to Eugene, like every 100 feet or so, there's another crucifixion, there's another crucifixion. And the whole reason that Rome did this is because they are wanting to send a clear message: don't mess with us. We are the power. We have the authority. If you mess with us, this is what will happen to you. Now, what happened to them? Mark doesn't really give us any details of what it was like, but when you study history, you find that they would take the victim, and if the victim wasn't naked already, they would strip off his clothes. They would then pin the victim down on that crossbeam, and they would drive these massive nails either through the hand or through the bones in the wrists. They would then take another nail, a single one, and drive it through both feet. They would lift up the victim, and just the way that they did it, it would cause the victim to immediately begin suffocating, because the only way that you could breathe as you're hanging there would be to push up on your crucified feet. And if you had any strength to lift up on your hands, it was excruciatingly painful. And for Jesus, whose back had already been torn and ripped apart as it's rubbing against that rough wood, and you would go up and you would breathe deeply, and then you would slouch back down and exhale exhale. This would last hour after hour after hour. You are fighting with everything in you just to get a single breath. Your bones would be pulled out of socket. You're losing control of your bodily functions. You're fading in and out of consciousness because of the pain. And eventually, your muscles would fatigue and begin to cramp, and you would find yourself unable to breathe anymore. And that is why most victims of crucifixion would die from suffocation. But the Romans, again, they're ingenious in the way that they would torture people. And if they wanted it to be carried out for a longer period of time, they would put a piece of wood that you could actually sit on, which made it easier to breathe in some ways, but it meant that the agony would last even longer. And again, what made this so brutal is not just the pain, which was extreme, but it was the sheer humiliation of the entire experience. You're naked. People are laughing at you. They're mocking you. They're spitting on you. Historians now believe that when they crucified the victims, they weren't lifted really high as we so often see in the movies, but in many cases they were down, sometimes even at eye level, which meant that people would walk around that victim taunting them, hitting them, cursing them. And that's what we see in our text. Verse 27, it says, they crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, so, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he cannot save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. And those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Jesus is enduring the physical pain, but he is now having to endure the emotional pain as the crowds are gathered around him, mocking him and taunting him. This is what we did to the Son of God. This is what our sin did to the Son of God. They're hurling their insults. In the Greek, that phrase is blasphemia. It's where we get the word for blasphemy. Blasphemy. He saved others. He cannot save himself. Come down off the cross, they said, then we'll believe you. Now that was a lie, right? I mean, Jesus had already done so much for them. He'd healed their sick, raised their dead, touched their leper. He has done so many things on their behalf, and still they did not believe. And if he would have gotten off that cross, they wouldn't have believed him either. You see, what Mark is showing us in this story is that when Jesus was crucified, he didn't just die. He was shamed. He was humiliated. Jesus had his name destroyed, his reputation destroyed. Jesus was disgraced in every way imaginable. And this last week, as I've just been spending time thinking this through, praying this text through, and thinking through that whole story of Mark 8 and denying yourself and taking up your cross and following after me, it made me realize, and it's such a reminder, that as followers of Jesus, that if we are taking up our cross, if we're pursuing after him, then what happened to him in our story, the shame that he bore, that will happen to us as well. There will be times in your life when you will be mocked and disgraced. There will be times when people turn on you and reject you, because the way of the cross is not the way of popularity and celebrity. The way of the cross is a downward path of humility and dishonor. Again, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he said it so well. When Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. Jesus, in John chapter 15, verse 20, he said, "A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also." Now, chances are most of us don't have that verse underlined in our Bibles. I love this verse, right? Such a promise, so awesome, right? It's not one that you're going to see on coffee mugs in Christian bookstores or t-shirts or bumper stickers. Yes, we're going to be persecuted too. Praise God, right? I mean, we here in the West, and we're just inundated, it seems, with almost it is a different gospel. And sometimes we hear it, on TV with these preachers that come on with big hair and big smiles, right? And basically the message is, hey, believe in Jesus, follow Jesus, and everything is going to be awesome. Man, your tennis game's going to improve. People will love you. You'll land a dream job. You'll drive an Audi. You'll burn more calories. It's like wonderful, It's what I like to call the Lego gospel. Everything is awesome, right? Like that's kind of what we hear in the West. But that's not reality, right? I know for a fact that's not reality in your life. In fact, just last service, I was hanging out in the lobby, getting to talk to some people and just hearing some stories of people who, because they're followers of Jesus, that there is a shame and there is a disgrace and a stigma that you're carrying. I was talking to one young guy, and he's in college at a local school here, and he's just telling me that there's not a whole lot of believers there. And in school, so many times, especially when you get to the university level, there's this unspoken narrative that the more educated you get, that the less you'll believe in God. Right? The more you study, the more you'll realize that none of this can really be true. But then you've found, as you've studied and you've gone to school, and whether it's the microscope or the telescope and the books that you read, it's kind of had the opposite effect on you. You're like, God's amazing, right? It's incredible. I can't believe this beauty and nature and science. It's awesome. And people look at you and they're like, why do you believe that? Well, why would you follow after Jesus? And this guy was telling me there's a stigma that he carries because he's a follower of Jesus. Maybe it's in your workplace, and kind of the narrative there is if you want to get ahead, there's people you have to step on in order to get to where you want to be. And yet you're not playing that game. There's ethics and honor and integrity, the way you're doing things. You're behaving in a godly way. You're caring for people and loving people. And you're not doing things the way that people expect you to do them. And as a result, your career takes a hit. Your reputation takes a hit. There's a stigma. There's a shame that we carry as followers of Jesus. Cultural shame. Shame that we feel from our own past. Shame that society puts upon us. Education, work, family, friends, neighbors. I was talking to another guy last week, and he was telling me, he said, yeah, I got baptized here a couple months ago. It's really amazing what Jesus has done in my life. But he said, one thing that's really been hard is he said, all these people who I thought were my friends are kind of turning on me. And he said that a lot of them are just coming up to him saying, we miss the old you. And he's like, you mean the old me that was drunk half the time and doing a bunch of stupid things? They're like, yeah. He's like, I don't miss that at all. But he's finding that those people that he thought were friends are no longer. There's a shame. There's a stigma. And that's what it means. That's part of it as we take up our cross and follow Jesus. It's a hard way. The call of Christ is to come and die, as Bonhoeffer said. So I know that this version of the gospel that we're presented with isn't reality based on our own life, but to widen the field even more, I know that it's not a reality based upon what we're seeing happening in the world today. We live in a time, a day, when Christians are being shamed on a vast scale. We live in a time when persecution is the highest that it's been in recent history. In fact, Reuters, I was reading yesterday, in this article, they said in 2013, Christian martyrs, the amount of Christians who were killed for their faith, doubled in 2013 alone. Right now, as we sit here, blessed and safe, and we have access to the scripture, and we can worship and sing, Right now, there are 100 million of our brothers and sisters who are living under an active threat of persecution. Many of you have been following what's been happening in Iraq lately. And regardless of where you stand and fall on the political spectrum, I think most of us can agree that what's happening there right now is a fiasco. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of brokenness. And what we've seen over the last couple years is a rise of this group called ISIS. And the last couple months, it's become really predominant, more so in the news. Not enough, I don't think. But ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And again, many of you may know this already, but they've taken over a good percentage of Iraq, a good percentage of Syria. They're knocking on the door of Jordan. And what U.S. strategists are saying is that ISIS makes Al-Qaeda look like a bunch of Boy Scouts. In fact, Al-Qaeda disowned ISIS, saying that they were too extreme. So that's the kind of group that we're dealing with here. Everywhere ISIS is spreading right now, they are spreading an extreme version of Sharia law. Now, what has that meant for Christians in Iraq? It's meant really one of two things. You can stay and be killed, or you can flee. And so it's come out in the news in the last few weeks that as ISIS goes into these cities and urban centers, they are now marking Christians with the Arabic symbol. There it is. In Arabic, it's the letter N for Nazarene. They pronounce it as Nun. And wherever Christians are to be found, homes and businesses, they're painting that symbol on the walls, on the doors, on the skins of these believers. And for those of you who are familiar with what happened pre-World War II, there's a lot of eerie similarities with what happened in the Holocaust. And now Christians have had to flee for their life. Last month, ISIS overran Mosul, which has had a Christian presence for 1,700 years. One of the oldest Christian communities in the world. And they came in and destroyed churches, historic Christian sites. Many of you may have seen this on YouTube. They actually blew up Jonah's tomb, which has been a place where Christians have visited and taken pilgrimages to. They've burned manuscripts, looted homes and businesses. A few days ago, they took the city Karapash, and Christians there have had to flee with nothing but their clothes. And as of last week, over a quarter of Iraq's Christians have been driven from their home. They've been displaced. And only now is it beginning to hit the mainstream media. There's a recent CNN interview that you can watch online with a guy named Mark Arabo. And he's Iraqi and American as well. And he warned of a Christian genocide. And this is what he said just a couple days ago. He said, children are being beheaded. Mothers are being raped and killed. Fathers are being hanged. The world hasn't seen an evil like this for generations. This is happening right now. Today's newspaper, The Guardian, front page, save us from death. Millions of Iraqi Christians having to flee for their life. A few years ago, there were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Now that number is less than 200,000, and it's dropping every single day. I found out this morning from Mike McDonald, who is actually going to Iraq next month as part of our church. And he's going to be meeting with some Christian brothers and sisters there. And he told me this morning that as ISIS has progressed and they give those Christians, hey, you can convert or die, 95% of Christians have said, we will not renounce the name of Jesus. We're going to stand up for him. Today, Iraqi Christians have issued a worldwide plea, begging the world to take notice. And pastors have said, August 10th, today, make it a day of prayer and intercession for our brothers and sisters in the Middle East. And they have asked that the church would stand behind them in supporting them through prayer. When we see these pictures, when we tune in on CNN or Fox, when we read what's happening, I don't know about you, it makes me just sick to my stomach. I think it's just part of the reason I just could not sleep last night. This is happening, and our hearts break. We see the shame, the dishonor, the humiliation that right now they are carrying because they're followers of Jesus. This is what our brothers and sisters are going through. And again, Jesus said that it would be this way, right? We saw earlier, he said, in this world you will have tribulation. John 16, verse 33. Notice he doesn't say, you might have tribulation, or there's a 50-50 chance it could happen, we'll see what happens. No, he says you will. Some translations put it this way, in this world you will have persecution. Jesus is saying, if you're gonna follow me, know that the way of the cross is hard. There's shame and dishonor and disgrace and pain and humiliation and people who will turn on you and reject you. But I am so glad that verse doesn't end right there, right? Many of you know the rest of the verse. In this world you'll have tribulation, but what? Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. That's the hope. You see, brothers and sisters, this is what makes the message of the cross so powerful. The cross isn't just about Jesus died and that's it. Spoiler alert, he didn't stay dead. We'll see this in a couple weeks. He rose from the grave, right? Death could not hold him back. 3 days later, Jesus broke the chains of sin and death. He came out of that tomb triumphant. And what that means now is that when we look at the sorrow and the heartache and the pain and the brokenness of the world, what the gospel says, what the cross and resurrection means, is that through sorrow will come hope. Through shame will come honor. Through hate will come love. Through violence will come peace. Through death comes life. Through crucifixion comes resurrection, because our hope is that greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. And we believe that as followers of Christ, that no matter how the world may mark us, whether it's the Arabic Nun, or the stigma and the shame that right now you are carrying because you make Jesus your Lord. No matter how the world may mark you and mock you and humiliate you and shame you, what the gospel says is that doesn't matter, because there is one who was marked for us, Jesus. He took our shame when he died on the cross. He took our sorrow when he died on the cross. He knows what it's like to be disgraced. He's been there. And what that means for us today is that we have a present help in time of trouble. We have a friend who is closer than a brother. And we believe that even though the world may mark us, right here, right now, we are marked by the love of God. His acceptance, his approval, his grace. And we believe that in the end, Jesus will be victorious. That every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus is our Lord. And it's because of that promise, and it's because of the resurrection, that we today, brothers and sisters, we can stand with our family. We can stand with those right now who are being hurt and harassed and killed. We can stand with them in this hope-filled promise that in the end, Jesus will be victorious. And it is for that reason today that we can have hope as well. Whatever you're facing, whatever hurt you're going through, whatever stigma and shame and humiliation that you're experiencing right now, Jesus is with you, and Jesus will conquer, and he will never leave you. He will never forsake you, and greater is he that's in you right now than he that is in the world.